Well, first of all, I'm so happy that you're down here now and that we can start this. So the aim of tonight's discussion is, as I said, is to look more closely at the work of Rodney Leon. I'm so happy you're here.
Thank you.
And Faith Ringo's work through wonderful Madeline Weisburg talking about that through her eyes. Both architect and artist whose work honestly has shaped Black history. There's no question about it in both cases. And the Black experience. In each case, both the architect and the artist really has sort of created new narratives and within the visual arts and design and architecture. So we'd love for you to talk a little more about that as we go forward. But very definitely, I'd love to introduce Rodney, who was born and bred a New Yorker, which is great. He's a child of Haitian immigrants, parents. He graduated from Pratt Institute. And he got a bachelor's in architecture from Yale University and a master's in architecture there from Yale. He actually had a bachelor's in Pratt and a master's at Yale. He's currently, right now, the spring 22, and you told me that you just finished, right? As the Louis Kahn visiting assistant professor, which is amazing at Yale. I mean, that's a huge honor. I've always admired Louis Kahn's work so much, so it's so great that that's who you represent and that's who you're doing. He's also the founder and principal of Rodney Leon Architects, and he's the architect of background. And I think what's unique is your diversity of building types that you worked from, Rodney, whether it's been including housing or churches or transportation projects in New York. You've really done some amazing pieces. And other areas in the US as well as abroad in Haiti. I think Rodney's work focuses on protecting the historic role that free and enslaved African people and that whole travel of what happened and how they got there. And played very much in how it built New York, really. He very definitely in his practice has used history and culture to actually promote a more expansive and inclusive language of contemporary architecture. So I will be very interested in hearing what you have to say as you get into it more. And Madeline Weisburg, as you all know, as I introduced, is the curatorial assistant at the new museum. And she's been discussing Faith Ringo's work of over 50 years. It's pretty incredible. She holds an MA in modern and contemporary art history and critical and contemporary stories from Columbia University and a dual BA in art history from, I think it was Tufts, if I'm not mistaken. And also studio art, right? So you actually even practiced that. She also had previous curatorial positions at the Jewish Museum and the Department of Photography at MoMA. There's no question that Faith's work has stretched many generations, and themes of her work resonate to this day. And I was so moved by this amazing retrospective that was put together. I think that if all of you haven't seen it, it's still on, which is one of the reasons that we tried to make this happen today versus waiting future in the summer. I wanted people to have that experience. What's so interesting is how it resonates today and captures the psychology of the rationalized country. Her commitment to art is profound in the way it communicates the deep history of defining experience in Black life in America. But I think it was really done, and it's so interesting that Victoria talked about people and storytelling. That's what this is all about, and that's what I think very definitely Faith's work has been about that. Powerful Weeks reflect that experience in New York. She's done a lot of work outside New York, but we decided tonight, because of the history of and our 45-year legacy of what we do in New York, that we would concentrate more on her work here versus what she's done on her travels to France and other places. But I think that would be very important. And she's very much involved with the civil rights movement, and that's been a pretty amazing experience that Faith has gone through and what she shared. So Madeline will talk about that. So now let me turn this over to Rodney first, and he can go through his incredible work. I think if you are not familiar with it, you're going to be going, wow. And then I'll turn it over to Madeline, and she will talk about Faith's work. Rodney, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Marjorie.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everyone, for inviting me here this evening. I apologize. I had I was only supposed to show, I think, a few slides, but I decided that since we're going to be here, I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to hopefully be able to experience somewhat virtually the two projects, the African Burial Ground National Monument project and the project at the United Nations called the Ark of Return, which is the United Nations memorial to the victims of slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, which are two projects which I think are really ideal in terms of our discussion this evening around place and culture and history and the significance of that. So for those of you who are not familiar, the African Burial Ground is a national monument. It's located on in an area between Broadway and Foley Square in Lower Manhattan. It's about a 4.5-acre site. The National Monument Site is part of a larger historic district, which is called the African Burial Ground, the Commons Historic District in Lower Manhattan, that was established by the City Planning Commission in the early 90s. And that site, that historic National Monument Site, is actually about 20 feet below street level because it's an 18th century cemetery, an 18th century site. The memorial site, which is a 1/4-acre site, which is on Duane Street in the corner of Elk, about a block from Broadway and a block off of Foley Square, is about just a fraction of the actual memorial site. So this slide that you see here is a slide of one of the 7 elements that we use to develop the memorial, which is a series of multisensory experiences. This is a series of mounds, which we call the ancestral reinterment zone. These mounds here mark the location of the reinterments of the remains of the African people that were discovered here in 1991 during the construction of the Federal Office Tower on the corner of Broadway and Duane Street. At that time, the bones that were uncovered were actually being discarded. And if you don't know the history of that, those bones and those remains, it was found out that the construction company and the General Services Administration was doing that, and the community rallied around this cause, along with the support of the current mayor at the time, David Dinkins, and some also federal support, to stop the construction and to establish the site as a historic monument site. Some years later, after the bones were actually, and the remains were analyzed at Howard University, an archaeological report was established. And in 2003, 419 remains were reinterred at the site. So these mounds here, next slide, mark the location of those remains. The remains were actually placed in hand-carved wooden coffins that were carved in Ghana and lined with kente cloth and placed within these individual coffins. And they came, and there was a procession that occurred that they came all the way from DC and they stopped at different places. I believe they stopped in Baltimore, Philadelphia, Newark, before they ended up at the African Burial Ground for a reinterment ceremony. And then all of these remains were then placed into the ground, and we designed the mounds to kind of mark that as a kind of a sacred place. So this ancestral reinterment zone is adjacent to the plaza that you enter as you come into the memorial sites. Next slide. And the second element that we created was this wall. And this wall we called the Wall of Remembrance. On that wall you'll see that there are inscriptions in 4 lines, and you'll see a shape of a heart-shaped symbol called Sankofa. That Sankofa symbol, if you go to the next slide, that Sankofa symbol was a symbol that was found on the remains of one of the bodies that was uncovered. So this heart-shaped symbol, which was in the form of, I believe, some type of like a brass tax that was on top of the lid of the coffin, is thought to be part of the Ndinkra people's symbol, and that Sankofa means to look back into the past in order to move forward into the future. So it became a kind of an important symbol and reflective of the significance of the site itself. And then next to that is the engravings for all those who were lost, for all those who were stolen, for all those who were left behind, for all those who are not forgotten. We call that an ancestral libation phrase, a kind of like a funerary dirge, a kind of a prayer to say, to make sure that people, when they come to the site and they see that first element, they acknowledge the site as a sacred site in their minds and understand that it's a sacred site. Next slide. This was just an image of a gentleman when I was at the site not too long ago visiting with some people. People come by there impromptu sometimes, and they actually have sacred ceremonies on the site. This gentleman was part of like, I believe a group from, I think they're a group from Ghana that was visiting and stopped by and had a libation ceremony and also kind of like a music ceremony at the site. And that is really the kind of a thing that we would like to see those kinds of sites happen, that they become absorbed and they become a part of like the fabric of the city for people to celebrate as well as to commemorate. Next slide. The third element is on the southern wall of that chamber. What you see here is a map, which is a 21st century map, 21st century grid, and you see a kind of like a sandblasted, irregularly shaped area. This map is the 21st century map superimposed upon the 18th century burial ground profile, and it outlines the 4.5 acres that extend from Broadway to about Foley Square. And just to the south of here is like Chambers Street, and just to the north is about Duane Street. You can see that this rectangle here, that quarter-acre site, the memorial site, is only a fraction of the actual burial ground site, where an estimated 15,000 remains, maybe more, are currently buried. So when you're walking along from Broadway to Foley Square, many of the buildings that are constructed upon that 18th century cemetery. So that illustrates that. Next slide. The memorial has two main pieces, which is a chamber, we call the ancestral chamber, and a kind of a circular court. To get to the court, you have to pass through the chamber or spiral down a ramp. And when you pass through the chamber, we have here what we call the door of return, which is a reference to a door which is in a slave castle in Gorée Island in Senegal. And that door of no return, the slave castle, represents a place where many African people were taken, never to return. And we felt that this would be a counterpoint to that, this idea of healing, this idea of like returning, this idea of kind of finding a place in a space for us to reflect about that. So next slide. This is an image of the orientation of the door that you would pass through in alignment with the circular court once you pass through there. Next slide. Once you come out of the actual chamber, you're in that lower level court. So the idea is this kind of a transition of a kind of like a profane or a secular space of the city to like a more of a lower sacred space closer to the original burial ground, that transition. So you have this 20-foot tall element here that you pass through, kind of like a gateway, and the height of it corresponds to the height that you'd have to go down in order to hit the original 18th century burial ground. Is a kind of like a reference. And it creates a space that's separate and apart from the noise and the distractions of the urban environment around you. Next slide. This is an image of the actual door of no return when I was visiting in Senegal a few years ago. And like you can see like the water beyond and the idea of people being taken back through there, never to return, and the idea that we want to be able to return. Next slide. Once you come out of the court, there's a series of symbols in this circle that surround you in the circle. That element is called the circle of diaspora. All these symbols are reflective of a lot of different religious transformations and cultural transformations of African culture of people in the different parts of the Western Hemisphere. So you'll find symbols that are both coming from African references, but also from South America, the Caribbean, and other places, as well as religious symbols that are more contemporaneous as well. That shows a diversity of the complexity of the culture that's evolved over time of people that were taken from Africa. So that circle of diaspora is about a space where all of this is now coming together again. So it's meant to kind of like encircle us in understanding the different variations and complexities and diversities of the culture. Next slide. And you can see this a young woman here looking at the last few symbols, which deal with mostly spirituality and the idea of God and worship. And the last symbol is a symbol of the crossroads, where you're crossing from kind of like the spiritual into the spiritual realm from the kind of the living realm. Next slide. So there is a spiral procession that once you come down a ramp that you can kind of see as an outline in the court itself. And that spiral has a series of engravings in it. Those engravings are reflective of a random sampling of the remains of the people that were uncovered during the archaeological excavation and the excavation at the site. We don't know the names of the people, but we do have descriptions of who they are, as well as analysis around them. So what we decided to do in the next slide was to engrave and give people a sense of who was uncovered when they were buried there. So the archaeological report is actually accessible on the National Park Service's website in case you wanted to get more in depth. But you can see like burial number 363, which was a child between the ages of 1 and 2 years old. We do know that this is not chattel slavery that you would experience like in the South, but the African people that were here at the time in New York were working in a variety of kind of agricultural, smith work, all kinds of like heavy labor. and that people did not live to a very ripe old age. So most average age of a person you would find was like maybe up to like the age of like 40 on average, and many people died even younger than that. So we wanted to give people a sense of who the people were that were buried here in this site. Next slide. That's a detail of that. Next slide. So that spiral continues to the center of the court. And then you can see that the court itself is like the last element, which is a place we call the ancestral libation court, where a ceremonial ritual can take place. But it's also structured as a kind of like a map. And you can see the radial pattern of the map that talks about the dispersal again of the culture in a kind of like a way coming from the central West African coast. And that seventh element in that space is meant to be a space of individual reflection or groups to come together, and also kind of larger groups to kind of ceremonially come together. Next slide. That's myself and one of the architects I was working with. We're just looking at how that space could be used for libation. Next slide. This is a group of people who adopted the site themselves. It's a Shinto shrine. I've come to the site a few different times, and different people have been able to take the space on in terms of ancestral worship or religious worship of different religions themselves. So this was one group that I had come across when I was at the site, going through a kind of ancestral ritual. Next slide. And this is like shows how the space can actually accommodate larger, more ceremonial functions. This was like during the dedication ceremony itself that occurred back in 2007. Next slide. The next project is the Ark of Return. As we had mentioned earlier, the United Nations Permanent Memorial to the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, which is on the plaza of the United Nations. Next slide. The primary elements and the words "acknowledge the tragedy, consider the legacy lest we forget" were themes that were established by the committee that created the competition around the project. So we actually took that theme, that three-part theme, and those elements, and that we began to create our design concept around them. Next slide. One of the things that we were very inspired by was the transatlantic slave trade, or the idea of the triangular slave trade maps that show the connections between the manufacture of goods and the transportation of people between Africa, South America, the Caribbean, North America, and Europe as well. Next slide. And we also were inspired and really traumatized around the images of the people that went through the Middle Passage, and the images of the ships that really forced people to go through sometimes journeys of 1, 2 to 3 months to cross that passage. I think it's estimated over 2 million people might have died during that journey. Next slide. These are sketches of the idea of what we call the Ark of Return, where we are thinking about 3 types of experiences, 3 types of elements that acknowledge the tragedy, consider the legacy lest we forget, that you pass through in the idea of a vessel of return for the spirits of people that were lost during the Middle Passage. So you can see that those kind of triangulation of the vessel is inspired by the triangular slave trade. Next slide. As you walk into the actual plaza, at the end of the plaza, the Ark of Return shows you see there's a kind of like a triangular oculus or window that kind of draws you in. Next slide. You can kind of make out the outline of a circular element within this actual sculptural space. Next slide. And as you get closer, you see that it's actually a map element. So this is almost a kind of like a sister monument to the African Burial Ground Monument in Lower Manhattan, where this one deals with, it's not site specific insofar as this is not a burial ground site, but it's meant to think about the triangular slave trade and also the issue of slavery in a larger context. So next slide. This is meant to be an interactive surface. When you touch it, you can see that there's some engraving of the triangular slave trade routes, but in our research, we're also able to identify 66 locations where people were taken from throughout the West African coast. So there's 66 points where you can kind of touch, and we've documented also in the memorial that become part of that map in acknowledgement of the tragedy. Next slide. One of the things that you'll come upon is a horizontal figure in a white robe, of a person who is meant to be what we call a Trinity figure, reaching out towards you, drawing you into the space in considerance of the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade and the Middle Passage. Next slide. So you kind of come around into this triangular entrance off of the plaza, and you're meant to pass through that space and interact within the space. Next slide. And you see that there's an alignment obviously within the architecture of the UN itself in terms of its materiality, but also a kind of counterpoint in terms of the linear, rectilinear language. We have this triangulation language there to kind of like balance it out. Next slide. And then when you come into that space, this Trinity figure is meant to be an androgynous figure. It's meant to be a representative of the men, women, and children that died during the Middle Passage. And this figure, this spirit, is meant to be an idea about taking that person, that spirit back to the place that they were taken in consideration of the legacy. Next slide. That figure was carved by artists that we worked with that came from Carrara, Italy, specifically to work with us out of some sketches. One hand sculpted the robe, the other hand sculpted the pieces of the figure out of black Zimbabwe granite and Carrara marble. And you can see like the detail and the fineness of the work. I think it was very happy with that. Next slide. The inside of the chamber also shows the engraving opposite the figure. If you remember the maps of the slave ships in acknowledgement of that journey. Now there is another vessel with another journey in terms of like how we're returning these people, spirits, back to hopefully to the place where they're able to return, and we're able to kind of create that space of reflection inside the ark as well. Next slide. So the last element is essentially meant to be a font pointing in the direction. You can't see it here, but there's a metallic plate with all the engravings of all the names of all the locations that we had researched there. The idea is you're pointing in that direction, and that's meant to be a kind of a reflecting font or pool of water that's turned on at certain times of the year for people then to be able to introduce water as a meditative and spiritual element into the sculpture. Next slide. And that plate is actually down here in the lower level over here, and this is the last slide for this project. Next slide. So I wanted to talk about, just briefly mention, we're currently working on a project for the Eric Edwards collection, the Cultural Museum of African Art, which is a collection of art that's been collected over a period of close to, I think, almost 50 years. Over 50 years, that contains somewhere close to maybe 4,000 artifacts from all the different cultures and all the different countries in Africa that stretch back maybe up to like maybe 2,000 years. So there recently has been a grant that was given to Mr. Edwards to establish a museum and a space in Bedford Stuyvesant. So our latest project in these kind of cultural spaces that we're working on with Linda and a few other collaborators is the idea of establishing a physical and a virtual museum interactive space for people to be able to experience not only the physical abstract artifacts themselves, but also a virtual experience that we're trying to weave into that. So that's our latest project, and I wanted to, mention that as well. And thank you very much for listening. Hope I'm not too much far over. Thanks.
Okay. So hi, everybody. So again, I'm Madeline Weisburg, and I work in the Curatorial department at the New Museum, and I'm very happy that I had the opportunity to work with curators Massimiliano Gioni and Gary Carrion Moriari on our retrospective on Faith Ringgold, which includes over 50 years of work made between 1963 and the early 2010s. And we can move to the next slide. So I'm sure many in the room are familiar with Faith's work and maybe have seen the show already. It's on view until June 5th, so you have a couple weeks left to see it. But just for a reminder, Faith Ringgold is an artist, organizer, and educator. She was born in 1930 in Harlem, and much of her work is very associated with New York City and with her home neighborhood. She moved to New Jersey in the 1990s, but despite that, her work has a really, really important connection to New York City, and overall has had a profound impact on the history of post-war art in the United States. She studied art education at City College in the 1950s, and then also got a graduate degree there, and was a public school teacher teaching art in New York City schools for about 20 years. And I know that there are some other I'm a product of the New York City public school system, and I know there are others here, and so it's, you know, a real proud moment, I think, also just for kids who grew up in the city and for people who grew up reading her children's books, which she started writing in the 1990s, you know, to be able to see the range of her work. I think a lot of younger artists and art historians are very influenced by her more politically motivated work from the 1960s and 70s, but also by her work with textiles and storytelling that has extended really throughout the rest of her entire life. If if anyone's going to freeze this week, I'm sure you're going to see work on textiles there. It's something that is really very much in the air right now, and I know that a lot of artists are very influenced by her work. So behind me, you see a painting, which maybe you've seen at MoMA. It was included in their reinstallation of their galleries when they expanded the museum, and it's called American People Series number 20, Die. She made this in the summer of 1967 when she was given a show at a gallery, a cooperative gallery on 57th Street, so, you know, the Chelsea of that time, and was able to work at a larger scale because she was given studio space and had this exhibition opportunity. What she wanted to do with this series of paintings, she called them murals, even though they are paintings on canvas, is that she wanted to represent everything that was happening in America at that time, nominally, how the civil rights movement is moving into the more radical politics of the Black Power movement and how she's becoming radicalized over the 1960s. So here she's really responding to uprisings that are happening across the United States that are caused or, you know, the product of the fight for civil rights by Black communities, and also as a response to police brutality or white supremacist actions and, you know, the systemic racism that caused, you know, Black Americans to not have their civil rights. And so what you see here is an image of, you know, an uprising. You can't necessarily see who's causing it, but you see this moment of chaos and violence, and there are, you know, white figures and Black figures in it. She's spoken specifically about being influenced by Picasso's painting Guernica, but, you know, her paintings also really extend to, you know, Mexican muralism or maybe social, you know, regionalist painting from the 1930s, where there's this real social background to working at this large scale. And, you know, MoMA only acquired this in 2016, which is really meaningful in terms of the history of her reception. You know, she has many works that have belonged to institutions before that, but, you know, to enter this canon maker in 2016 is a real indication on how MoMA or, you know, the powers that be have accepted her work and how that came sort of belatedly, despite her having this amazing reputation for many decades. So we can go to the next slide. And so that's just a view of the room at the museum, and you can see another painting she did in the summer of 1967 for that show, American People, that's called The Flag is Bleeding, which is another important work of this moment. And we can go to the next slide. So in this grouping of works, I mean, I could talk for a very long time about her work. I wanted to just include pieces that had a very specific New York City connection, although we can say that for a huge amount of her work. So in the late 1960s and early 70s, she became very active as an organizer for a number of causes in New York City and then also outside of it. You can see in our exhibition, we have an amazing selection of her political posters that she did, where you can see the causes that she threw her support behind that ranged from supporting the prisoners who died at the uprising at Attica Prison to Angela Davis, the feminist movement, you know, just a Black Panther Party and beyond. She was in part of an exhibition in 1970 called the People's Flag Show that happened on Washington Square Park at Judson Memorial Church. That was an open call exhibition where people submitted work that responded to the American flag and also was in the context of, you know, the anti-Vietnam period and people thinking about how there were rules in the United States that prevented desecration of the flag or misuse in certain ways, and she ended up being actually arrested with two other artists for it and became this huge art world event about what, you know, artists are able to represent in terms of free speech and also just a real microcosm of the politics of this era. And we can move to the next slide. I just included a couple pictures here. On the left, she's speaking in Judson Church, and you could see one of her paintings behind, which is called Flag for the Moon. And then on the right, she is protesting in front of the old Whitney's building, Breuer Building on Madison Avenue. She was part of a number of protest groups that were fighting to make museums more inclusive for artists of color and for women. Specifically at the MoMA, at the Whitney, she was part of a group called the Ad Hoc Women Artists Committee, and among many other collective organizations, including some that she started, including with her own daughter, where they were fighting to have the Whitney annual show, which is now the biennial, be 50% women, and then 50% of that would have been Black women. And the Whitney biennial wasn't 50% women until about 10 years ago. So, we have a lot of documents at the museum that show this incredibly prescient work that she was doing at this time. So we can go to the next slide. So one of the, I think, among the many impactful paintings that we have in this exhibition is this extraordinary work that she made in 1971, which is called For the Women's House. So she got a grant to make a painting for some kind of public entity in New York City, and she decided to make a mural and dedicate it to the women incarcerated at Rikers Island in the women's prison. And she wanted to make this uplifting painting about the kinds of jobs that the women could maybe imagine to have after they were no longer incarcerated. Many of these jobs would not have been available, so there is this sort of utopian thinking behind it, but it was supposed to be uplifting, and it was shown in a public space there. So you see someone who's supposed to be the president, a professional basketball player before the WNBA was established, a doctor, a bus driver, and so it's supposed to also be across a rubric of age and race. The really fascinating story behind this is that in 1988, this part of the women's prison was transitioned into a men's prison. And they said that this was inappropriate for the men to look at, and they actually whitewashed over it with the intention of painting something else on top of it. And in Faith's telling, a guard actually called her and her daughter, Michelle Wallace, up and said that they had whitewashed over her painting, and they were able to restore it and move it to a different part of the island, to the Rose End Singer Center, which is the women's prison. It was an amazing show at the Brooklyn Museum a few years ago, and since then, there's been an effort on the Faith's family and the museum and many other entities to try to get it to be in the Brooklyn Museum's collection. And so now it's going to be on long-term loan there after our show, but it came directly to us from Rikers Island. And also just for some context, it was most recently in a hallway behind a processing room, so it really wasn't in a place where it was visible to the public. And you can really see, it's hard to see in this photo, but you can see how it's been treated over the years. There are these weird screws in the middle where you can see the paint has been scraped off it, but it really holds the history of who's seen it and where it's been over time, and I think it's very impactful to see it. So we can go to the next slide. Her relationships to her family is a huge part of her relationship to place, I guess we can say. Many examples of her work have a really deeply autobiographical element. In this soft sculpture that she made in 1973, this is a portrait of herself and her siblings and her mother. She was very inspired by West African forms of masquerade, and she started making these soft sculptures, and we have many examples that were actually used in performances in the exhibition. We can go to the next slide. So many of you probably know her work specifically through her quilts, and this is the first quilt that she ever made. It's called Echoes of Harlem, and it was made in 1980. Throughout the early 70s through the early 1980s, when her mother unfortunately passed away, she actually collaborated with her mother, who was a dressmaker and fashion designer, and Faith learned how to sew when she was a child, so they would sew these works together. And if we think about the feminist movement or feminist art more largely, collaboration, collectivity is such an important part of it, and quilting is an inherently collective activity, and for her, this collaboration is beginning with her own family member. And so this work belongs to the Studio Museum in Harlem, and it, shows a range of portraits of people who, maybe she would have known in her community, and is a very special work. So it's her first quilt, but it was also the last work she ever did with her mother, who died very shortly after. So, it also has this very poignant history behind it. We can go to the next slide. So another facet, I don't know if I'm running out of time also, but another really important facet of her quilt making is something that she called a story quilt. So often she's working in a sequence and she's writing directly onto the quilt. She's writing a story. And so this is an early example we have of her story quilts. It's called the Street Story Quilt, and it's 3 different pieces, and on them it's telling the story of a family in this walk-up building in Harlem over 3 decades. And it really charts tragedy, triumph, this family history that is also encapsulating a specific history of a building and then also of a neighborhood over time. And she also really shows off her skills as a writer with these works. They are really incredible to read as well as to look at. So we can go to the next slide. This is probably known, I think for a lot of people, this is her most famous quilt because it was later adapted into a very popular children's book, also called Tar Beach, in 1990, and definitely for children who were born at this time, this was a very important book, but also just for families still. She wrote many, many children's books after, really started an entire new career, essentially as a children's book writer in the 90s, and a lot of people just know her as a children's book writer. They don't even know about this other work that she made. So in Tar Beach, you see this, very poignant and beautiful story of this family that's on the roof of their building somewhere in the northern part of Harlem, and the children are looking up at the sky, and it's summertime where their parents are eating and playing cards on this table, and the little girl imagines herself flying over the George Washington Bridge. And so, it's this real love letter to New York City, but also this, very magical work, also showing how much she cared for and thinks about the imagination of children. And we can go to the next slide. This is a work that also just shows how her politics really have continued throughout her entire career. She made a series in 1997 called The American Collection, where she's really thinking about the position and the way that women of color, especially Black women, have been shown throughout American history, and then also in visual culture and art history. And in this example, you're seeing this horrifying depiction of what is clearly the Middle Passage with this burning slave ship, but there's also this sort of magical or historical rethinking in it, where she's pictured the Statue of Liberty as a Black woman holding, a Black child. And so, there are many things at play against the, the horror of what's being depicted behind her. And, if you come see the show in the next few weeks, the idea of New York City and of place and of her own autobiography as it relates to place is something that absolutely comes out across her work. And I think that that's especially inspired by her investment in feminism and this idea that, her personal life is something that is inherently political. She's very associated with second wave feminism. And this, I think, comes across in her work throughout her incredible career.
Well, I just have a few questions for you both. Just curious, Rodney and Madeline, in terms of faith, what kind of emotional state were you in at the time that you were creating these incredible projects? And what were you trying to get across? I mean, I know you talked about it, but I really want to know where you were in your mind versus where you were in the physical space. And in terms of Rodney, you and your architecture, with Madeline, in terms of faith, where was she? I mean, her career spanned, and it was not easy. Where everything she was trying to do, she wasn't well accepted, and people, she went to Europe and came back, and everything that was going on, and she really had a story to tell. And I just want to understand where these two people were. I thought that would be a very interesting thing for people to understand in terms of your, what you've produced and where you're going.
Well, in terms of like an emotional state, it's kind of hard to pinpoint like a particular emotional state at a particular point in time, because the projects that are, let's say, memorialization projects, they kind of span a significant length of time. So from the time that the initial, let's say, the burial ground competition started, I think it was around like 1989, and by the time the project was done, it was like 2007. So you're talking about, maybe like, 8 to 10 year span of time. But I would say that, you know, throughout that whole time, I was very focused for whatever reason, and I would say inspired to hopefully win the competition and to get the project done at all costs, no matter what.
So many people who competed with you. I mean, it was incredible. It says so much about who you are and your work, and the fact that you were chosen, I thought, was amazing and so phenomenally and well-deserved, by the way.
Thank you. So there was like, you know, it was part of a process. So I mean, by the time that, you know, we were able to be selected for the design, there were so many people fighting to stop the construction, to work with the city to establish the historic site, to work with the federal government to also elicit a certain amount of concessions from them, and to establish it as a national monument, to also create an interpretive center that's in the building adjacent. And what a lot of people don't know about is also there's legislation for there's supposed to be a museum in the area as well, which is supposed to be kind of a Smithsonian museum. It's supposed to be established. So it's an ongoing struggle, and the memorial is just like a piece of that ongoing struggle. So there's a sense of like I would say a heavy sense of responsibility, but also a kind of a passion that goes along with doing the work. So I would say obviously I was very passionate and focused about it. So that was sort of like my emotional state for a very long time, just kind of like the focus, I would say.
Well, I think that emotion is certainly something that you see in many ways across Faith's career, you know, even if we're thinking about the, you know, more positive, you know, expressions of joy or maybe sorrow. We have some really beautiful works that are in the show that she made after her mother died as an expression of grief that I don't have in the presentation, or, you know, anger at the political situation in the work. And I also was sort of echoing what you were just talking about a little bit. You see that first, the sheer number of works that she made throughout her life and this perseverance that she had where, you know, her exhibition opportunities are going in and out and in and out, and she's always finding this sort of diagonal way to create a new career for herself, whether it be you know, exhibiting at college galleries or starting a new career as a children's book author, or, you know, her work as a public school teacher, that she was always sort of at it over and over and over again in a way that is sort of astounding how much she was able to produce throughout her life, just considering everything that she was doing. I mean, if you just think about the specific moment of the early 1970s, you know, working, having teenage kids, but also being an organizer, also making these paintings, also, you know, being out there in collaboration with other artists at all times. And so I think that there's a real range that you can see, you know, of her personal life, because she's not shy about including her personal life in her work.
Well, it's sort of interesting too, Rodney. You went even with your history of Haiti and doing something with soft places, and I mean that's phenomenal. Why don't you talk a little about that? I think people would be very interested in what you. Granted, it's not New York focused, but I think it says so much about you from a humanitarian perspective of what you're trying to do to help these people.
Well, my background is both of my family comes from the island of Haiti. My mother and my father were both born in Haiti. And I think that maybe some of the work that I'm doing that draws from some of my cultural background in terms of what I was taught about history of the island growing up as an independent republic that was able to be the first independent black republic. So I think that within that idea of like the importance of like history, but also the importance of struggle for liberation and struggle for freedom in the face of, you know, adversity. You know, I was always, you know, taught that as a kind of like a reference point to draw on that culture. So I think that somehow that also translates to the importance of what I think is the work to kind of uncover places and spaces and ideas and histories that have not been shared, that are part of the fabric of our society, specifically New York. I mean, we are a city and a country of immigrations and immigrants. Mm-hmm. And I think that part of the work and the process of the work is in uncovering and in revealing the complexity and the beauty of the cultural fabric of the society and finding new ways to express it in a contemporary way. So you can kind of like, you know, just like even that idea of that Sankofa symbol, to be able to go back to the past in order to draw from it in order to move forward into the future, and not in a kind of like a way which is, I would say, a historical, but in a way that's sort of like trying to find a contemporary expression that's more reflective of how we've evolved and how we kind of can come together and express that past in a way that it has not been in many parts of our society, but we're still struggling to kind of like come to grips with that kind of like a past and history. So as a Haitian American, I think my family always instilled with me a certain kind of pride in spite of like a lot of the challenges, and also draw from the spiritual and the cultural richness and the traditions of Haitians in terms of creativity. Haitians tend to be very well known for their painting and sculpture and those kinds of things, and you can't really go to a Haitian household without finding like a painting. It's very unusual because there's so much of a rich artistic tradition. So to find joy and beauty and creativity in spite of any kinds of like adversity, I think is part of my cultural background. Yeah.
And Madeline, I'm so curious, why did Faith decide to go into creating quilts and storytelling? What was that all about? I mean, I know so much of it was that she wanted to try to get those stories across, and she worked like with her mother and all that, but what was the genesis of all that?
I mean, she grew up knowing how to sew, so working with textiles is something important. Also, there's a rich history behind quilt making as a practice done by groups of women, especially Black women. There are many histories of things like Gee's Bend, where there are groups of people working together in the South, specifically within African American communities, making quilts, and that was a real expression of community and also just a political coming together of those groups. I mean, if you see the exhibition, you can really see the trajectory of how she started working with textiles and then they blossomed into these story quilts. But she originally started with textiles that were hung on rods that were inspired by Tibetan Tanka paintings. So those are devotional paintings from the 14th, 15th century that were done on fabric. And that's really where she first started working with textiles, and then it sort of blossomed from there and became this incredibly rich field to explore, ideas of storytelling, autobiography, just making. Fabric has so many associations. We live in fabric, so it's just a part of everyday life. That proved to be, a huge area of creativity and production for her.
So I think what we're going to do now is, first of all, Rodney, thank you so much. Madeline, I really appreciate you both taking the time tonight to be here to talk about the importance of empowered place and how your work has fit into that. It's really both Faith and Rodney. I mean, it's incredible. And Madeline, for your voice was very special. So thank you. We're going to go upstairs now and enjoy the wonderful wines of Neil Rosenthal's group, and Neil's great generosity. And Victoria, thank you. I really appreciate it. And all of you, for those of you who can stay, I hope you will and enjoy it. The evening will go on. So thank you all. Thank you.